So, good day and a very warm welcome to all of you who are here, both in the room and following us online. I'm Elinka Benson, the CEO of SNS, and I have the great pleasure to welcome you to this seminar that we do in cooperation with the Institute for International Economic Studies at Stockholm University. And I will leave to today's moderating, Jan Hassler, professor at the Institute, to introduce the topic. But I would just like to welcome our speakers, Minister for Foreign Trade and International Development of Cooperation, Benjamin Dosa, and Professor Dave Donaldson from MIT, and Helene Mellqvist from Latour. A very warm welcome to all of you, and to all of you who are here in the audience. And with these words, I leave the floor to Jan.
Thank you very much. I don't think this topic needs any introduction, actually. We all know what it's all about and how important it is for, not the least for Sweden. So we are very glad to have Dave Donaldson here. He's going to give us an introductory speech of something like 20 minutes. Dave is a Canadian economist, but also has some connection to Sweden, I just heard. So one of your claims to fame is that you participated in the Swedish orienteering competitions when you were young. What was it? O-ringen and 5 days and things like that. But he also has some other things on his CV. He is a professor at MIT. In 2017, he got the John Bates Clark Medal, which is considered to be the next most prestigious prize in economic sciences. And I guess you know which is the most. But that's maybe to come. We will see. Dave focuses research on trade and development, both in kind of an historical perspective and both with regard to developed and developing countries. So it's going to be very interesting to listen to your introduction. And then we're going to have comments from Benjamin Dosa, who is Minister of International Trade and Development, I guess, right? Is that the English title? And we have Helene Mellqvist, who has a very long experience in export-oriented Swedish industry. So it's going to be very interesting to listen to you. But I give the word first to Dave.
Well, thank you very much for the introduction and for the chance to be here. So I'll speak today about, of course, this topic of trade. I'm going to focus mostly on, the impact that we think trade has on the economies around us and how that matters for our lives, both in the past and also today. You might note the missing lack of any mention of the future here. That's partly deliberate. I'm, I guess, fundamentally a historian, a user of historical data at heart, an empirically oriented economist. And so I will say I have trouble, claiming any ability to predict the future. But I'll end with some comments about that towards the end. So when I think about trade, I think about this, a famous book, one of the most famous books about the topic of trade written by anyone ever, actually written by a former minister for international trade of this very country, Bertil Ohlin. And the curious thing about this book is that the title is not just international trade, but also interregional and international trade. And that has always stuck with me. I was always very interested in this region of the world. This is colonial India, the region we now know as India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. The blue lines you're seeing here are in some sense the way that people would move goods around British colonial India circa roughly 1850. And the black lines are just regions, districts of British India that one can statistically study, annually starting in around 1850. And of course, a curious thing happened around 1850. In fact, 1853 is when this little red dot here starts to appear. That's the very first railway line that was opened up in British India in 1853 in the city of now Mumbai. But every 10 years or so, this network thickened considerably. And so by 1870, you could imagine being in this sort of the heart of the country here, a region, for example, like Jabalpur, where for the first time ever, really in the history of this subcontinent, it was very easy to move goods thanks to these red railway lines, these iron horses, around the country and to other parts of British India, as well as, of course, the world. And that was an enormous shock to both interregional and international trade at the same time. And of course, it thickened considerably still. So here you can see sort of more of these decadal snapshots right up to about 1930, when the network of rail as we know it in British India had been kind of more or less fully built. And you can imagine this, the transformation of economic life that took place for people in this time period. And of course, that episode wasn't alone. So these are examples of studies in recent work looking at other major rail networks that rolled out around the world and transformed trade around that sort of late 19th century, early 20th century time period in kind of Prussia, the United States, China, Italy, Argentina, and of course, also Sweden. So zooming in on that one, this will be an example you are familiar with. I'm sorry it's not the easiest map to digest, but you know about Sweden's railway network that was built in the late 19th century. But do you know about the economic impact it had? Well, these Swedish economists, Lindgren et al., I wonder if any of them are in the room, they might be, but they wrote a beautiful paper about exactly this impact on economic development throughout the kind of local governments of Sweden, so the communes of Sweden. And they estimated something like this. So this is focusing on rural, so it's throwing out the 100 most urban parts of Sweden in 1911 or so. So focusing on the remaining roughly 2,000 relatively rural Swedish communes. And focusing on the outcome of kind of non-agricultural GDP. Per capita, it looks very similar. So think of this as kind of industrial output, essentially. And what you can see is for a typical commune, this is sort of an average effect across all communes of Sweden, sort of life was pretty flat prior to the arrival of the first railway line penetrating your commune. And then industrial development took off. You know, so GDP, non-agricultural GDP per capita grew by about 100%, even more than 120%. Though admittedly, this took a bit of time. You know, this was not an immediate impact. This was kind of a slow development. But after 30 years, these places were more than twice as industrial than they were initially. And that's the type of typical impact we see when we look at these historical events of access to interregional and international trade. You can imagine that another thing that happened more recently is this sort of technological change in the way we move goods around the world. And that, of course, is played out internationally. So these are two studies that I thought you might find interesting, written by the economist James Firer. On the left, what you're seeing is a scatter plot of growth in GDP per capita over 35 years, from 1960 to 1995. And on this axis is something a little bit curious. Let me try to put it in plain words. For every pair of, imagine you have two ports anywhere in the world, like say Stockholm and Tokyo, you could calculate the distance if you were to travel by sea. And of course that would involve circumnavigating the Suez Canal and South Asia and eventually reaching Tokyo. And then you can imagine, of course, calculating also the straight line distance, the flight distance, right? So for every pair of ports, there are two distances, the sea distance and the flight distance. And so for every country in the world, we can, like for example, Sweden, which is buried in this kind of blob here, we can calculate the trade weighted, in 1960 trade weights, average distance by sea to all the other ports in the world, and also the average distance by air to all the other ports in the world. And you can take the difference of those two distances, the sea distance and the air distance, and that's what's being plotted here. And so what you can imagine this is important because over this time period of 1960 through 2000-ish, a dramatic transformation happened to shipping, which is that air shipping, was invented and got much, much cheaper. And as you can see, there were some countries that saw their average distance to the world, change dramatically. So countries like New Zealand, for example, this did not change much at all because, if you're in New Zealand, the sea distance and the air distance are pretty similar to everywhere. If you're in, for example, Korea, this has a huge effect. Your sea distance versus your air distance are quite different. And that correlates, relatively strongly with GDP per capita growth throughout the time period. So just to put a number on this, Sweden benefited relative to New Zealand by a number that adds up to 1% of GDP per capita growth per year for 35 years. So that's kind of, a 50% growth in GDP per capita that Sweden, according to this estimate, could be grateful for being relatively benefited by the growth of air travel, or air shipping, rather than sea shipping. This is a similar analysis, but looking at the tragic 8-year period in which the Suez Canal was shut down. So we had an 8-day period a couple of years ago in which the Suez Canal was temporarily blockaded by a container ship. This was an 8-year blockade due to a war in the region. And so throwing out the countries that were directly affected by the war, Fire plotted all the remaining countries of the world here. And as you can see, every country here appears twice. So for example, India appears there and there. That's because when the Suez Canal closed, their sea distance grew, right? They suddenly had to travel around the Horn of Africa to get to their trading destination, many of their trading destinations like Europe. And so that's why India appears here with distance growing. And India appears again here when distance shrinks when the Suez Canal reopens in 1975. And as you can see, there's evidence here that for these countries who saw that distance grow, their GDP falls below trend. And when the distance shrinks again, when the Suez Canal reopens, GDP rises above trend. And so to put a number on that, Sweden was not affected by this. Most of Sweden's trade didn't go through the Suez Canal at this time period. But India was dramatically affected. So this is an 8% drop in real GDP per capita, and then an 8% rebound in GDP per capita when the Suez Canal was closed and reopened again. So these are important effects of big technological change in trading technologies around the world. The next thing you might be interested in with current events is not a technological barrier to trade, but tariffs, a policy barrier to trade. So of course, one of the most dramatic changes in global tariff policy in recent years was the 2018 mini trade war, we might call it by today's perspective, between the United States and mostly China. So this was the initial, attack in this trade war. This was the United States raising its tariffs. I'm sorry if you can't see the resolution here, but for example, one of these lines is the washing machine tariff. That's in red there, mostly Chinese washing machines. This purple line here is the second wave of tariffs on many Chinese imports. So these are actual tariff rises, kind of 10%, 20%, 30%, that the US imposed on China and other trading partners, including the EU, starting in 2018. On the right-hand side is, of course, the retaliation, the Chinese raising their tariffs on US imports. So you're familiar with these events that took place 7 years ago, I'm sure. But what impact did they have? Well, the work of Feigelbaum et al. Has very nicely quantified these things. And so here are some ways to see that. So we see, again, this typical kind of time series estimate here, normalized around a date I'll call 0, which is always the date at which a given tariff impulse happens. So for example, this one happened in February 2018, so that would be date 0 in this analysis. What you see here is from the perspective of the United States, their imports basically fell off a cliff. This is a massive drop in imports in the relatively affected products from the relatively affected origin countries like China, for example. So this is a dramatic drop in quantities traded. But curiously, there's not much of an effect here. This is kind of a flat line, statistically speaking, and it can rule out quantitatively important effects as well. Basically, a flat line in terms of the prices that Americans pay for Chinese goods prior to the tariff, if you think about it. So if you slap a 10% tariff on something that costs, $10, we might talk about the pre-tariff price, which is $10, and then the post-tariff price that the consumer actually pays, which is $10 plus 10%, i.e. $11. So this is looking at the pre-tariff price, the $10 in my example. And as you can see, that's very flat, which basically means the consumers are paying, the American consumers in this example, are paying the entire 10% of the tax, right? So if they were in some sense sharing the burden of the tax with the Chinese, we would expect this pre-tariff price to drop. It would be as if the Chinese lower their price prior to, in response to the tariff being imposed, such that Americans don't pay the full 10%. To the contrary, that's not happening at all in this analysis. This is completely flat, implying that Americans pay the whole thing. Symmetrically, that's roughly similar story, but a bit noisier happened from the perspective of US exports to retaliating countries and goods. These things were much smaller, so maybe in the grand scheme of things, so maybe that explains smaller effects. But the imports are dropping again here, but no effects on prices of American exports. So this is basically Americans paying for these tariffs, you might say. Another connection to recent, much more recent events, of course, is tariff uncertainty, right? If there's one thing we can be certain about when it concerns American trade policy right now is that it's extremely uncertain. So this is a plot analysis done by Caldara et al. They use scraping of all news articles in the United States, every year from 1960 onwards, searching for words like trade policy, tariffs, lots and lots of synonyms, but also uncertainty, ambiguity, and lots of synonyms for that. As you can see, there was a bit of a spike in sort of trade policy revealed uncertainty in this 2018 event. And then, of course, this is April 2025, the massive spike in uncertainty that we're living through to this very day. This is just, of course, literally off the charts, rise in trade policy uncertainty, at least revealed this way. But what effect does trade policy uncertainty have on people? Well, this analysis by Pierce and Schott looked at the curious case of the United States trade policy on China, but in 2001, when China joined the WTO, one has to remember that countries like the United States already had low tariffs on China. So they didn't sort of offer lower tariffs, in return for the China joining the WTO. But in the case of the US, what they offered instead of lower tariffs was the promise, of kind of relatively certain low tariffs. So they removed the threat that they might place China on you might call the naughty list, on which much higher tariffs prevail. So every year that sort of permanent so-called normal trade relations was being renegotiated every year in the US Congress. But finally in 2001 they granted China the so-called permanent normal trade relations and removed the uncertainty. So what effect did this have? Well, this analysis by Pierce and Schott tells us that this sudden change in tariff uncertainty vis-a-vis US policy on China led to a dramatic inflow of Chinese goods, as well as US manufacturing industry responses, such as an 8% relative drop in employment in the relatively affected industries compared to less affected industries. So once uncertainty was removed, the floodgates in some sense opened, and real responses like employments kind of responded in turn. Now, of course, those employment effects, had real consequences for American workers, and the work of Otter, Dorn, and Hansen and Song has made this very clear. This analysis tracks all American workers who had a job in 1988 and classifies them in some sense into two bins. Those who in 1990 were in the types of industries that were going to go on to see a dramatic inflow of Chinese import competition, compared to other workers in other manufacturing industries that were not going to see that flood of import competition. And basically the ones who were relatively exposed to that eventual flood of import competition did see their earnings drop quite dramatically relative to the other group throughout the 90s and the 2000s. So this is a pretty big deal. It's sort of a 3% drop in relative earnings per year, sort of for 17 years, if you're in one of those relatively exposed industries compared to a relatively less exposed industry. So that's, of course, not good for those workers at all. The one thing I'd ask you to remember, however, is that this type of involuntary kind of job loss, this was mostly explained by job loss, not reductions in your wages on the types of jobs you get. This type of involuntary job loss is happening all around us every day due to shocks that have nothing to do with trade. It's just a sort of fact of economic life, you might say. And this typically has severe consequences for workers. So this is a wonderful study by Berthaud et al. Looking at 7 European countries, one of whom is Sweden, another whom is Denmark in the sort of the blue there. This is looking at the sort of probability of being employed after undergoing a typical average involuntary job loss in these countries. As you can see in Sweden and Denmark, this is not a small deal, but sort of within about a couple of years, the change in the probability of being unemployed is about 5%. You're 5% more likely to be unemployed, you might say. But in sort of Southern Europe, that's the red lines here, such as Portugal, this is more like a 30%, right? This is even for 5 years later, we're looking at a 20% reduction in the probability of being unemployed. America, which is of course driving these numbers, is sort of, according to the work of Song and von Wachter, somewhere like halfway in between Sweden and Denmark, where it's not such a big deal, and Southern Europe, where it is a much bigger deal. It's kind of halfway in between. And so it's, it's sort of you might say it's like it's a half well-functioning labor market for helping people get retrained and finding new jobs. And that is essentially what's underpinning this relative effect that's being studied here. Okay, so that brings us to tariffs and sort of, the future of tariffs and sort of the arguments one might hear about why they're a good idea. To these, I always start by applying what I call in my head something like an Olin test, which would be, would you be in favor of these tariffs if they applied to intra-national trade or inter-regional trade, as he called it? And so, of course, a classic reason you might be is just that foreigners are different. We don't care about them if you have a national or biased patriotic perspective. And so you might love a tax that would basically get foreigners to pay the tax. And this phrase, the foreigner pays the tariff, has been offered by the US president many times recently. As you've seen, the evidence I showed you earlier, in 2018, that just didn't happen. The foreigners did not pay the tariff, Americans paid it. In addition, foreigners retaliate. And we've seen that in current events as well as in 2018 events. And so I don't think this is a very good argument to start with. One could argue that tariffs help shelter workers from the type of import competition harm I showed you earlier. The problem is that harm is done by shocks. Those shocks are happening all the time in many, many ways that are far bigger than trade shocks. And so really the solution to this is not tariffs, it's some kind of social security system that would actually provide a net, a safety net, like you have in this country, as I sort of showed you. One can, of course, argue that a great thing about tariffs is that they can help promote and enlarge specific sectors, be they kind of green sectors, war-relevant sectors, maybe high-technology sectors where we think that knowledge spillovers are very important. The problem with that argument, it's perfectly fine in theory, but there's obviously a much easier way to make sectors grow, which is just subsidize them directly, right? I mean, tariffs are just a poor and leaky way to try to help your high-tech or green tech or wartime capacity sectors grow relative to just subsidizing directly. So if the goal is industrial policy, there's a name for that. It's industrial policy. And finally, there's of course one hears about kind of geopolitical goals, where essentially what we're saying is we're trying to harm foreign parties. I know nothing about that. It might be a perfectly rational argument. I would just point out that it doesn't usually work out as well as planned. Recent events with Russia, of course, have highlighted that the many, many ways that countries can get around things like sanctions. So where are we headed with trade these days? As I promised you, I'm a backward-looking guy. I find it hard enough to learn about the past, what actually happened in the past. The types of studies you've seen here, like understanding what Swedish railroads did to the Swedish economy, is already a hard enough problem relative to knowing about the future. But I would offer a couple kind of reference points that I have in mind, my own mind. One is that the dramatic change in transportation and communication and internet-related technologies has, of course, dramatically changed over the last 100 years, and of course will continue to do so. Right? I don't need to tell this audience about the importance of digital-oriented exports that are a new type of exports that are increasingly hard for even well-intended tariff policies to try to reduce. And that kind of inescapable fact is I think, going to be increasingly inescapable. Another fact I'd point to when it concerns manufacturing is this analysis. So economists call this structural change, that is looking at the share of our economy by maybe employment or value-added, GDP, in broad sectors such as agriculture, manufacturing, services. These are pooling lots and lots of countries' evidence. One of these pieces of evidence comes from Sweden, as well as more recently industrializing countries such as Japan, Korea. And what you see is this incredible fact that countries kind of, their agricultural sectors shrink because agricultural productivity has grown like crazy. We can feed the mouths of a country with far fewer workers than we used to have to do 200 years ago. And the same phenomenon is happening in manufacturing, this kind of inescapable inverted U shape that every country goes through and is going through, regardless of their level of openness, regardless of their level of development at the time it's happening, regardless of the technologies of the world at the time it's happening. It's kind of an inescapable fact. And it comes from the rapid, amazing technological progress that has happened in manufacturing, just like agriculture. Of course, services is kind of the laggard, that it's had less technological improvements, and as such, it's a growing share of employment and GDP, but kind of from its failures rather than its relative failures rather than its relative successes. So finally, on this topic of where we're headed, I would again be backward looking and point to these guys. I'm sure you don't know who they are. They were two Canadians who in 1988, I was a young boy, and I remember this election. This is an election that was very closely fought between these two candidates. The guy on the right won. But the main theme of the election was, should Canada join NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, or not? That was roughly 40 years ago. We can look back and ask Canadians, you know, kind of, was that a good thing? Are you glad that that happened? Even though this was incredibly tightly debated between these two guys, Canadians, regardless of their political leanings, this is a survey in 2017 admittedly, but regardless of their political leanings, the red and the blue parties are the two parties these guys were in at the time. Canadians are in favor of this. You know, at the time it was not at all obvious that getting into a trade agreement with a massive and richer country to the south and a much, much poorer, low-wage country, Mexico, to the south, would be a good thing for a country like Canada. It was not at all clear even to trade economists at the time. Yet nowadays, I think most Canadians consider this a great success. And I think even though the future of trade can look scary to observers and to participants in this thing, I do think episodes like this, where we look back sort of 20, 30, 40 years and ask, was it a good idea that we joined that trade agreement? The answer is yes. And I think that's as good a guide to the future as I can hopefully offer this room. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dave. You can stay up here. And please also, our commentators, please come up, both of you. So while you come up, so a lot of the discussion is about what governments and policy do to reduce trade with tariffs. Is it something that governments can do to promote trade too? I mean, I guess you touched a little bit on it that when you said that in some countries like up here, the negative consequences of trade are less felt on workers, and maybe that's something that's important.
Absolutely. I mean, the trade shocks, like probably 10 times bigger counterparts, all other economic shocks, are something that societies need to grapple with. You know, it's a fact of economic life, and it always has been. And I completely agree with you that the rest of the world has much to learn from countries like this one about how to do that, how to put those systems in place to help people cope with trade shocks and embrace trade, as well as every other shock, you know, that economies experience.
So let's go to the politicians. Benjamin.
The same question, or?
No, you can talk about what you want.
It's not very common that I'm allowed to do that. But to answer that question, I would say yes. It's a lot of things that we can do from a political standpoint, and actually things are going in the right direction from a European standpoint right now. Not with the US. I mean, we all know what's happening on the other side of the Atlantic Sea. But just to compare. I've been a minister for 8 months now. When I went to my first council meetings in Brussels, it was basically Sweden, maybe Finland, maybe Denmark, some of the Baltic states that said we have to negotiate more FTA agreements, we have to move them faster. Now it's basically 2 to 3 countries that aren't saying that, France among others. So things are happening things are moving in a good direction when it comes to the European trade policy, and I always say that, of course, we can't decide the US trade policy, but we can decide the European and the Swedish trade policy. And when I'm traveling around the world, I see that other countries are viewing the European market as a more reliable partner than our American friends. So from both sides, there is an increased interest for signing an FTA agreement, and that's a good thing.
Helene?
You said that I can talk what I want to talk about.
Yes, you can talk about whatever you want.
No,
if it's about trade.
Even if it's about trade. No, let's do that. I'm an industrialist since long back. I've been working with the different export companies and so on. So I would like to this also give a flavor. What are we actually doing right now to meet all of these things? So I would say that I really love the Swedish governance model that we have in many of our companies. You know, I represent Latour right now. We have a very delegated structure where we let the companies close to the customers, close to the markets, decide. Same thing in Atlas Copco, where I'm in the board, and also even the giant Volvo Synergy machine is doing the same thing. You make the decision as close as possible. That makes us agile, fast, and I think that is something different that we have here in Sweden, which is very important now when we mitigate this. And the organization is also well trained. You know that now. We have had a couple of crises behind us, and that we know how to increase prices because that's what we need to do, as you say. So we just start that machine and that knowledge as well. We also work on our competitiveness, on our productivity and competitiveness as well. And we know our supply chains. I remember that when we did the semiconductors analyze when we had the pandemic, we were down to tier 8 on looking at our suppliers. So I mean, we know these now, so we know our competitive landscape, both on the supply chain and also on the customer side. That does not mean that it's not difficult, because it is very difficult anyhow to meet these circumstances that we have. And I'm also glad that I'm not glad, but I see what you end with is that this is, even if we can do this short-term answer on this, there is a global threat on this on the long-term or mid-term and long-term perspective. And that's where I'm more worried, actually. What are we going to happen? And then it's a bit, how do we do in EU now? Because I think we have a chance. We have an opportunity, really, in the region right now to build something that you are onto as well. But we will be hit on the global space. So that, I think, is very much where our industrialist companies are thinking and standing right now.
So one question that came up in my mind is, we've seen that kind of the economies in general are moving away from goods into services. And this trade, the trade frictions and potential trade wars are mostly about goods, right? So how important really is trades in physical goods, and is the relevance of tariffs there going to kind of fade away? So what do you think, Helene? Is the importance more that you have kind of a big scope for your companies, and the goods trade is not, where the goods are produced is not that important? Is that a fair description?
It is a fair description, and we also regionalizing based on what happened, also on the actual goods. And you also, if you read one annual report, right, you know that everyone is looking right now to increase in the part which is service, which is also made on the ground, and also digitalizing products as well. That is increasing substantially, but on the same side, we still have the physical goods in the middle carrying this. So it's still important, even if it's decreasing, it's still a carrier of the service and the digitalization that we are making.
Free trade in services, what's happening there, Benjamin?
Well, I would say that we have a lot more to do. If you look at the inter-European market, I mean, all of us, we get taught in school that we have free trade in Europe, and that's mostly true for physical products, but not mostly true when it comes to services. So we have a lot to do there in a European perspective, and also updating the free trade agreements that are already put in place. Take South Korea, for example. We've had an FTA agreement with them for several years, but now we're updating it with a digital component as well. So it will be easier to sell your services and to make different types of deals and things like that. So I think it's important to do more at the European level, but also to update the current FTA agreements that we have.
But there's also discussion about this bazooka thing. That's focusing it to at least some extent on services, right?
Yeah, it's the ACI, the anti-coercion instrument. It's never been used in Europe before. And of course, the Swedish government were quite skeptical. We don't rule it out, but we're skeptical of using it, because it's not only services. We can hurt the procurement processes as well. It is a bazooka. Some say even it's a nuclear option. So if tariffs are taxes on our own consumers, then we shouldn't tax them too much, right?
So it's interesting you talk about kind of a better market within EU, but that also requires more of centralization. So is the government in Sweden ready to accept more centralization of power in the EU?
Well, it's more about harmonizing the rules. I mean, all of us European countries, we will have different rules about, how to build a truck, for instance, or the food safety standards of our agricultural products. So instead of having 27 different standards, we should just have one standard, so we can compete with each other, not by standards, but by the products.
But it's not going to be our standard, it's going to be EU's, right? So
yeah, but that's a good thing. That's a good thing for Europe, it's a good thing for Sweden. Just by increasing intra-European trade with 2%, Draghi says that it will fill the entire gap that the closing of the US market will create, just by 2%. So it sends a signal that we have to do a lot more at European level.
So what's going to happen in the future now? Anyone? Dave was a little bit reluctant. What do you think, Helena and Benjamin?
Well, I think that we will have. I think what's happening in the US right now is here to stay. I mean, look at the democratic side as well. They're not very free trade friendly as it is right now. I mean, it's been a substantial shift. It's not just Donald Trump. It's not just the current Republican administration. The Republican voters think this is a good idea. But then what's holding them back is I mean, you can fool your voters, but you can't fool the markets. And we have talked about the stock market for a while, but I think the bond markets are even more important. So that will hold them back for a bit, but I think the policies is here to stay as a broad concept. Just look at the China-US deal and the UK-US deal. I mean, the broad tariffs at 10%, they're still there. So that sends a bad signal for the rest of us. Of course, the European markets, we have a few muscles, more than the UK have. But what we have to do, as I said in the beginning, we can't choose, we can't decide over the US trade policy, but we can decide over the Swedish and the European trade policy. So I think we will see a future where the US is actually not closing down, but turning inwards. And then other economies will open up even more. And then the most important country going forward for the upcoming 5 to 10 to 15 years, it's China. What will the Chinese administration do? Will they continue to say that they're in favor of the WTO framework, but still have subsidies that aren't in line with the WTO framework? Or will they actually follow the WTO framework? I mean, that's one of the most important factors going forward for the coming 10 to 15 years. So I think we will see a world where the free traders will trade even more with each other. I just came from Vietnam. I mean, we have a very well-functioning FTA agreement with Vietnam. It has increased trade with Europe and Vietnam. I think it's by 60 or 70% for the last few years. So we will see more FTA agreements like that. But I think what's happening in the US is here to stay in some type.
But I guess it sounded a little bit optimistic there. It sounds like you think that we can do without the US.
We can't do completely without the US. The US is too big for us. And of course, in some sentiments of the market, I mean, they're a market where we sell lots of our life science products, for instance. They pay a lot for their services and their products. So we can't count them out, but I think it's important for us to sign new FTA agreements. And as I said, the interest from other countries for the European markets is increasing. Take the Philippines as an example, Indonesia, India. I mean, the Mercosur agreement, that's 4 countries in Latin America. It took 26 years to negotiate. Now we're talking about India, and it will hopefully be done to the end of the year. Oh. I mean, things are moving quite fast right now, and that's a good thing.
Dylan?
No, I really like to hear this, because I talked about the agile organizations and the creativity that we have, and particularly in our companies and the trade companies. We are hurt a bit with what's happening in the US. I think that's we have learned our lesson. We can't rely on them as much as we did. It gets a bit more difficult, but we open up so many other possibilities that we can actually use our fantastic goods and services that are invented here also. So I see that we will have a bump somehow, but I actually see quite positive on the future, but in another way. And that will, of course, cost money to redirect that, but that's what we need to do. And I really like the politicians and also making the way and having this as a priority. And you mentioned one thing is also important that you mentioned, that is to, and this is said everywhere, to simplify the regulations that we have in the EU, because that will help our competitiveness as well in many ways. So, but you know that already. We've been on that for a couple of times.
Dave, you're Canadian.
Yeah.
And what's the relations between Canada and the US? I mean, it's clear that Canada cannot do without trade with the US, I suppose. Or what's happening with that?
I'm slightly less pessimistic than Benjamin expressed about the future of U.S. Public opinion regarding U.S. tariffs. You're right. I do think voters have been fooled, by the way that tariff policy is being presented to them. One of the figures I ended with, I didn't emphasize, but even in 2017, this of course would be even more true today, but even in 2017, there was this dramatic red-blue American polarization of public opinion about how to interpret even a kind of plain facts thing like NAFTA after 30 years. The public opinion spread for very similar demographic voters was as big as 20%, purely due to political alignment. However, I do think that the events of the last month, the market reactions that you mentioned, the public reaction, the type of price pass-through that Americans are already talking about, I am optimistic that will have an impact on U.S. public opinion, on voter opinion, and that will put a dampen on this kind of policy action. I can't promise that it'll end up like the good old days of 2016 or something, but I'm relatively optimistic, or at least more optimistic than you said. And then Canada's reaction to this has been incredible. The political reaction with the latest election, standing up for principles of broad free trade on the continent. I think that's something that is becoming increasingly important to Canadians, even relative to the way it already was in 2017 that I highlighted.
Should we take some questions from the floor?
My name is Katarina Ringborg. I have a question regarding the trade of services. Why is it so difficult to get more efficiency into the trade of services within the European Union?
Is it Benjamin?
Yeah, I mean, of course, Sweden, we're probably the most strong advocate, one of the strongest advocates for simplifying, deregulate, to harmonize the rules. But of course, there are some vested interest in this. And I mean, when I travel to the council meetings, everyone is saying that we have to increase the services trade. But then you have the rules that actually have to harmonize. Then it's a lot harder to actually take them away and to create a single European framework of policy. So I would say things are moving in the right direction. It's going too slow if from a Swedish standpoint, but things are actually moving in the right direction.
Thank you. Lars Danielsson, Senior Advisor for Lumo Advice, but maybe more relevant here, 7 years as Sweden's EU Ambassador. I tend to share Dave's comments about the relative optimism about the future. I think the so-called Liberation Day on 2nd April was for the US economy what the Brits refer to as a Liz Truss moment. It was such a bad call that we're seeing effects now on the American economy. And what we're basically seeing in the negotiating tactics from the US since 2nd April is that they're backing down. Not to zero, but they're backing down, and I think that's a good sign. I have two questions. Having been involved in trade negotiations in the European Union for a long time, I note that almost always the big problem is agriculture. You showed in your charts that the agricultural sector from an economic point of view is not that relevant. Benjamin, do you think it would be possible for Sweden to advocate that future free trade agreements would leave agricultural side and just focus on other goods and services? Because I think that would be the only possibility to get quicker deals. Secondly, I think we need a new pressure group to try to restore WTO to what it usually was meant to be. Could the Swedish government go in the forefront to say, okay, now let's reinvigorate WTO, which has basically not been working since Trump won. Thank you.
Probably both of the questions are to me. When it comes to the agro products, few Europeans know that, but Europe is actually the largest net exporter of agri products in the world, the largest. So to remove that entire industry, I mean, Italy wouldn't vote for an agreement like that. And when we're talking about Mercosur, that's of course Brazil, Argentina, Paraguay and Uruguay. then one of the main reasons why we get Italy on board is that they see, to a large extent, big chances of exporting agri-products to Mercosur. So I would say, of course, looking at India as an example, we could negotiate it in trenches. So we start with other products and then move on to agri-products in, say, 2 to 3 years. But I think it's an important element to keep it. Because it's important for our manufacturers to stay competitive, and it's important to actually get the qualified majority that we need. So, but what I would say is that the countries that are most sensitive about this, Ireland, France, to name 2, even Austria, a third. I've said at council meetings just last week. I mean, those types of countries can't hold the rest of us hostage in this. We have to move on. We don't need consensus to sign a new FTA agreement. We have to move on, like France is doing in other projects right now in European at European level. So I would say keep the agri-products, not maybe in the first trench, but moving on in order to get Italy's support that's needed. When it comes to the WTO, of course, I often hear, not least from the business community, the WTO is dead. We don't need it anymore. It's true that the WTO isn't working in all ways. I mean, we have a panel system that isn't working, mainly because the US isn't appointing panelists to it. But the WTO for the last, 30, 40 years is at least keeping tariffs down. To a large extent, and is keeping China down. Not in the best of ways, but at least keeping them down. So I would say, of course, we need reform within the WTO. The European Union is trying to go forward with reforms, but it's hard without the US. So am I feeling optimistic or pessimistic? Somewhere in between. And I think we will see a system reforming itself that the US, okay, then you can stay outside, and the rest of us who like WTO and want to reform it, we will take another path together.
Dave, what's your view on WTO? Has it worked? Can it work in the future, or is the future bilateral agreements?
It absolutely has worked. It absolutely can work in the future. I think you're absolutely put the finger right on the issue, which is that, of course, just the weeds of this have been broken by U.S. actions starting in 2017, and one will hope that the WTO will negotiate a way around that. You know, it might involve a deep restructuring, but that might be what has to happen. But absolutely, it's a pillar of the reduction in tariffs that the world has seen for the since its foundation in 1995 and the gap before that going back to the 60s. And that is despite the parallel growth of bilateral and regional trade agreements. You know, you might have said in the 1960s that those two policy initiatives were competitors or strange bedfellows, but they have proven very much not to be. And that gives me cause for optimism in the future as well.
Good morning. Does it work? Yeah. My name is Jose Perez. I'm International Secretary at TCO, so that would be the equivalent to CLC or CSQ in Canada, representing unions in Sweden, the TCO. I have a question. It was touched upon on one of the arguments for labor to be in favor of free trade is some kind of effective social system that we have in Sweden. But there is also another point, and which is very concerning, and that is that the Trump administration has also gutted the U.S. international labor, the Department of Labor, their international work for combating forced labor, trafficking, child labor, and so on. And that is concerning not only because it's, of course, moral not very good, but it could also lead to a much more unfair trade. So my question is probably more to the minister. Is there something that Sweden and the European Union can do to step up and fill that vacancy that is now left by the White House? Because I don't see that maybe that money will come back in the short term, even though if the tariffs are lowering. Thank you.
Well, I would say from a European perspective that, of course, it could be some companies that have problems with that, but on a policy framework level, that's not an issue, because in order to sell your products or services, you're not allowed to have slavery or child labor and things like that, trafficking victims. And of course, in all our FTA negotiations, we're tackling those issues. But as a whole, it's not a problem for us. But of course, it could be specific companies that have issues like that.
Rickard Eriksson from Swedish Bankers Association. I wonder, especially to a question, especially for Helene, and it's how do you view the long-term uncertainty effects regarding US? How important do you think they are?
They are extremely important for the relationship that we have with the US, because what we love within business is, of course, the certainty, always. And that has taken a hit, and that's what I mean. We are hurt right now in the relationship, and that's why we need to seek other paths. But of course, that's quite serious, that we can't trust each other. Yes.
Is it that uncertainty kind of delays, you're postponing decisions?
Definitely.
And hoping for that things are going to be clearer in the fall, or?
Both postponing, but also making other decisions. Because what's happening is that you're waiting, but I mean, this is only, you can wait. Business is fast very often. It's long and fast. So you need to make the short-term decisions based on what you have here and now, but then you need to think of the long ones. And then you avoid uncertainty, because that is many of our companies, Latour, you know, has a very low risk level. So where we put our money is really where we are certain for a long time that we can build industries for generations. And that is difficult in an uncertain world, yes.
And you think that the new decisions are to move production to the US, or perhaps to redirect your trade? Or
we do everything. That's really like that. We are actually thinking about, we pulled out of the US in a couple of productions. We are re-entering again in some of our industries. Others we just stopped being in the US because we can't. So we took out some products. We do them elsewhere. We go to Canada, by the way. So I mean, this is you have to play with the entire toolbox that you have, depending on what kind of industry that you're in, thinking about this long-term relationship and the return that you should get.
Before all this started, there was a discussion about that we might be flooded with Chinese products. Is that something that you see?
Well, I'm a bit, it's difficult with China because they are sneaky. They are much more clever in this sometimes than what we are. Look what happened with the car industry, and now that has actually been going on for quite a long time, decades actually. So where we are right now. And I think they are choosing industry after industry to actually have a similar situation. And I think that's, you have to observe that in every industry that you're in and to see what's actually happening. So I don't think you can say that, I don't think we will get all the Christmas toys that you don't get. I don't think that's realistic because that's what people are talking about. But on our competence, our really competent products that we have, which has a lot of intelligence that we have in Europe, we need to take care of them. And that's why I like so much now the EU tendency that we finally get some money and investments into these new technologies, because that is a good possibility for us.
A final question? No? Any final words from the panel and from Dave? Dave?
I would just, was it Jose? You asked a great question about labor impacts. I would just remind us that, sorry, I maybe fell victim of a common tendency, which is to focus on evidence about some of the negative labor side impacts of trade shocks, sudden rises in import competition. There's the whole flip side of that, which is the opportunities presented by export markets that is the flip side of trade. The evidence for the sort of worker side benefits of that is much harder to find. And so economists like me have been less prone to show figures on those sides of things, but I didn't want to fall prey into that tendency again. I mean, there is one side that shows harm, and that harm can be much worse in less flexible labor markets, but there is also the entire flip side where the benefits are to be enjoyed that you've all talked about.
Okay, thank you so much. It's 11:30, and we give an applaud to Dave and the commentators. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dave.